am totally convinced that, again, not for the first time, remember, not for the first time, Bashar Assad has used chemical weapons. We don't need UN corroboration, but it'd be nice to have it. The President of the United States over a year ago said that if Bashar Assad used chemical weapons, it crosses a red line. We know for sure that he's used them at least once. Now here's the second time. Horrific, horrific. And if the United States stands by and doesn't take very serious action, not just launching some cruise missiles, then again, our credibility in the world is diminished even more, if there's any left.
American credibility, moral imperative. It's not just John McCain who says this is why, as a superpower, you have a responsibility not just to condemn, but to act. But we all know it's not that simple. The debate over what to do in Syria has prompted a larger debate over just when the United States, as I said, the last superpower in the world, should use its military force to either level the playing field or to right a wrong. Is it when the U.S. is directly threatened? Is that our standard? When our interests, our national interests, are under threat? Or should there be a human rights red line here that prompts us to act? And there's no simple one-size-fits-all answers to any of those questions, Andrew, but yet we find ourselves in that very debate right now.
And we found a few people writing and talking about this to frame the debate. The first comes from Samantha Power, the current U.S. ambassador to the UN, in a book she wrote 11 years ago. In it, Power cites a moral obligation, quote, when innocent life is being taken on such a scale and the United States has the power to stop the killing at reasonable risk, it has a duty to act, she wrote. The Washington Post's Eugene Robinson looks at the weapons and not the body count. Quote, are the relatively few deaths caused by nerve gas really so different from the many more deaths caused by bullets, rockets, and bombs? Yes, he writes, I believe they are. Part of his objection, the message of not acting would give to other world leaders. And finally, in the Post today, retired Army officer and Fox News analyst Ralph Peters focuses on the end game. Quote, before launching a single cruise missile towards Syria, Team Obama needs to be sure it has a good answer to the question, what comes next? Do you really think it's wise to send our missiles and aircraft to provide fire support for Al-Qaeda? That is exactly what you'll be doing if you hit Assad, Rich. So it's different levels of this humanitarian or just natural. And
I read the Peters piece. In some sense, he says, we got to take out Assad. But what's your end game? Where are you going with this? And everybody wants the perfect answer from this president. And no president could fix this situation with surgical strikes or whatever else, because you don't know. The unknown is more than the known about what happens next. So, you know, it's a tough spot. But, okay, let me go around the table, and Jeannie, you're commander-in-chief right now. And what a fun White House that would be. But what's your standard for when, not even putting troops in harm's way, but using Americans' military force? Because we could shoot tomahawks off the coast there, right into Damascus, and you're not going to risk American lives, but you're putting American military in play. When is that line acceptable?
You know, I don't know that I could give you a good solid answer to that. I think it's a question that we've asked over and over for years. I think historically in the United States there's been this case to be made since, you know, World War II, that it's any time there is, you know, large-scale human destruction, and Samantha Power mentions that. She talks about that. We saw that in Bosnia. President Clinton has been committed to that. And then there's the other side of this, which is, are we directly threatened? The problem I have, which what Andrew was talking about Eugene Robinson, is that it matters what kinds of weapons are being used. I get that, but the other side of that question is that if you then look at that, how do you justify those other deaths? And why aren't you then guilty of the same thing President Bush was, if you consider it guilty, of going in a preemptive strike? Because that's essentially what you're doing. I think the distinction this administration would make is, and they were critical of the prior administration, they at least have evidence of those weapons usage. But the UN, I mean, we know the weapons inspectors are going to just say if it was used, not who's responsible for using it. I mean, do we ever have clarification on that? The administration says yes.
This is the closest thing I can remember here to somebody saying definitively, the Arab League, for crying out loud, came out and said he used them. It's the Assad regime who gassed his own people. But Dominic, if I'm going to play devil's advocate, I'm going to say, and I happen to think we should do something here, 500,000 people in Sudan, on the sub-Saharan areas, have been wiped out in genocide here, depending on tribal connections, ethnicities, whatever the case may be. I don't hear people saying doing polls. Should we go in there and going after the Tutsi or whatever? Depends, I guess, the methodology of the weapons, like the ambassador said here, or I guess it depends also where they're from and what it matters. There's no oil interests, in the sub-Sahara, and maybe that's not why we're talking about it.
I couldn't agree with you more in terms of that. I really believe, as the President of the United States, it has to be done on a case-by-case basis, evaluating each individual one, whether or not the U.S. gets involved. Now, obviously, you don't want chemical weapons being used against people, so you have to do something in this case. But the other side of this, the flip side, and we have to be realistic, the U.S. cannot police the entire world. That's just not realistic. The U.S. does not have the resources to police the entire world. And there are many of us, we feel awful for the innocent children, the women, the children. But there are many of us that are worried about the budget right here in America. What about the lives of Americans that are suffering right now? They can't pay their mortgage and so on.
I think it's a false choice only because we've never, certainly for the 8 years of the prior administration, ever cared for 1 second about how we were paying for trillions of dollars in military expenditures for both Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, all of a sudden, the hypocrisy is we're watching every single red cent here that we spend on any domestic programs whatsoever.
And who's doing that? And who's doing that?
The same people who spent the money
the Republicans, the same people that are demanding major action in Syria.
I wouldn't make the budget or the bottom line of the cost of this to be determined, because really what we're paying for is missiles. And in fact, they even did a cost analysis of it. It's about $1.5 million when you look at the rockets or the Tomahawks that would be fired if that's the route we went to. So we're talking a rounding number compared to what we've done so far.
Richard, I think one of the biggest issues is, I think we don't have necessarily permanent friends or permanent enemies, but I think it's about our permanent interests. And I think strategically we've got to look at, if we strike Syria, what's the bigger picture? Which other possible enemies could rise up? And do we have the resources to go against an Iran or a possible North Korea or a possible Russia?
We got the resources, but I think we only care anymore about 3 or 4 players. I think we've learned it the hard way. Care about Israel.
Outstretching our budget. Can we afford to go into another war? And I don't think we can.
I don't think anybody wants another war, but I think that we've learned the hard way. Listen, the president tried to play a strong hand with Israel when he first came in. You've seen what he's done in the last 12 to 18 months. They've certainly extended more than a few hands here. They're not talking about settlements like they were and everything else. So Israel, believe it or not, I think, well, certainly the House of Saud, they care about Saudi Arabia, they're still ally, and now the Egyptian military. Nobody missed the fact that even after they opened fire on their own people, we just kind of said, not my problem. So those 3 and maybe Turkey. Those are the only people that we, at the end of the day, think that we can count on here to keep the Middle East from blowing up completely. So we're going to do whatever we can to help them out. But they're all saying to us, you got to do something about this guy.
But once again,
he can't use chemical weapons. You can't say nothing.
But once again, those are our permanent interests, and that's what I'm talking about. I think that's what it boils down to when we talk about the president's decision. Not necessarily, it's unfortunate, the women and children who have lost their lives in this war, but I think we've got to begin to put America first.
And Afghanistan was also in our national interest after 9/11, and Iraq was sold as being in our national interest. So the example before about whether we spent our treasure in those areas.
But you agree with me. All of a sudden, intelligence comes out, Andrew, that Tehran's this close here to have a nuclear power. You don't do it, Israel's going to do it. Somebody's going to hit those, whether or not it's going to take us 100, bombs to drop to blow up the bunkers. We're going to destroy the site.
But these are fairly clear-cut examples, the ones that you're talking about. If the United States is threatened, if our allies are threatened, if Israel is threatened, then yeah, we'll take action. Or if our economic interests are threatened, then we'll take action. I think everybody more or less agrees on that. As for the other, and I hate to call it an optional, but Syria is, sort of an optional engagement for the United States we're trying to decide whether we go in or not.
Maybe if the president didn't say anything. But the president said something, he's got to do something now.
You're looking for a standard, and it's not a good one, but it's when you make us come get you. And it's different from country to country, from interest to interest, from who's being targeted and what the means are for being targeted, and how much the American people can stomach seeing it on their TVs. This, regardless, if you put aside the chemical weapon mass destruction and what it sends to the message it sends to the rest of the world, this is just so disgusting that I don't think we can stomach it anymore, so we're going to take action on it. And there are other scenarios that you can imagine. You talked about the Holocaust yesterday. we didn't get involved in the Second World War until we were attacked at Pearl Harbor. If we had seen the pictures of what was going on at Auschwitz, we wouldn't have been able to stomach it. Once we started seeing some of the massacres in Sudan and other places, we started getting involved in other ways, maybe not as directly, because we couldn't stomach it anymore. It's a terribly inconsistent line, but I think that's the line that we have.
And do you think, before we wrap this up, that the appetite to get involved, to right wrongs, even if we all agree that it's stomach turning, is less now than it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago? Because the public just says, I'm tired of it, I feel bad. I mean, the picture of that dad holding up his kid in Syria, right, and just wailing here is, as a kid, clearly, you didn't see the external injuries, but the kid was gassed death in agony here, right? We all felt it. You know, it was like we felt it in a certain way after Newtown. We could all relate to being, that could be your kid, you know? I get the sense that the public is starting to say, I'm just tired. I don't want to go around the world anymore, you know? And I feel bad for the guy, but, you know, I mean, I don't feel that way, but I get a sense a lot of other people do, that it just can't be a fight anymore.
Well, I think to back that up, if you look at the Republican Party itself and this whole strain, there's always been a strain of isolationism in the Republican Party, but you see that increasingly, and I think that does reflect some kind of fatigue and a need to take care of, as Dominic mentioned, what's going on at home. And not only the Republican Party, but you know, a party represented by people who got us into Afghanistan, got us into Iraq, and you see a large segment of that party saying, wait, no more, we can't do this anymore, we can't do it responsibly, at least, you know. But I think, to go back to Andrew's point, part of the problem here is the red line that President Obama drew. The questions that you're asking us, he needed to answer when he was elected in 2008. He needed to answer it before he drew this red line. If he wasn't prepared to go in, this is a big problem for the administration.
And I know perception's more important than reality in this, but when you actually listen, and Andrew got the text earlier today before the show of what he actually said, it isn't how it's being interpreted by guys like me that's his red line. But like we said, it doesn't matter anymore. No one's reading the fine print. They're all going to perception. Hey, you called it. Now what are you going to do about it? And I think we're going to find out soon.
Even the Secretary of State gives that impression.
Oh, no doubt. I agree with you 100%. Now, when we come back, we're going to tell you about something that, trust me, you're going to be hearing a lot about in the next month or so. Treasury Secretary Jack Lew giving a warning here in no uncertain terms to the Speaker of the House, John Boehner. He's the tan guy on the side here, saying, we've got to raise the nation's credit card limit, and we better do it fast. And if you ignore it, you ignore it at the nation's peril. And what else can we and you at home expect from D.C. when the summer break comes to an end? We're going to tell you, trust me, you're going to be hearing a lot about this. We'll be right back after this.